Welcome to Drive the Daf. Clear, structured explanation of the daily Daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Pesachim Daf Pei Dalid contains two Mishnayos and two neatly packaged sugyas. We begin with a Mishnah which introduces the sugya of which parts of a Korban Pesach is one consider edible. It's important to know because if you consider it edible, then you can register to the carbon on the assumption that you're going to eat that part of the animal, and if you eat that part of the animal, you to the mitzvah. If, however, it doesn't count, and if you register and all that's left for you, all that you register to is to eat that part, you weren't registered to anything kosher, and you have not fulfilled the mitzvah, not of being part of a carbon Pesach Habura, and not of eating any part of the animal which counts. So we have to know that. And the second Mishnah will return us to the sugya of breaking bones of the carbon on a carbon which has a psul, and we'll have a lengthy discussion as to which types of psulim count to take off the isser of breaking bones and which types of psulim do have an isser of breaking bones. So first of all, let's begin. The first Mishnah begins with an introduction of how we define which types of parts of the animal are considered to be edible that you can't fulfill the mitzvah. And the Gemara will have two machlokes and amarayim on the subject and try to bring out the two machlokes. So first of all, the Mishnah says as follows: you define the edible parts of a sheep are the parts that of the same parts of an animal that if it would be a big ox, you would be able to eat it. Oxen are adult and their flesh is harder, and therefore some things are edible in a small lamb that aren't edible in a big ox, but it goes by how the big ox, if it's edible in a big ox, is considered food in the Korban Pesach. If it's not edible in a big ox, then it's not. And then the Mishnah adds a line, and it says, and cartilage. And it specifically mentions a cartilage on the end of the shoulder bone, and it says that and all other cartilages. So the Gemara asks the kasha right away. The Gemara says this is a self-contradictory Mishnah. Cartilage in a large ox is not edible. So how could you say that you define as meat as edible anything which is edible in a large ox plus cartilage? It's not true. Cartilage is not. So Rabbah has one answer to this question and Rav has one answer to the question. Rabbah's answer is that it's a machlokes. The first half is taught by one Tana, who holds that cartilages do not count, and the second half is taught by a different Tana, which has the cartilages do count, and you don't go by the large ox. Rava says you just have to insert a couple of words over here, and when we say that it goes by a large ox, it doesn't go by a large ox simply, it goes by anything you could cook and eat in a large ox. Anything which is edible via cooking in a large ox, even in a Korban Pesach, is edible by roasting. Roasting doesn't soften it as much, and therefore there are certain things which you could not eat roasted that you could eat cooked. But if you could cook it and eat it in a large ox, you can roast it and eat it in the Korban Pesach. And then it says mahin. What's the example of something which you could cook and eat in a large ox, but you could roast and eat? You can even roast and eat in a Korban Pesach, which is a young lamb. The example is cartilages, like the cartilage that are on the end of the bone. Okay, that's the Gemara's two explanations there. The Gemara brings a brisa, which has explicitly like Rava. Brisa spells out anything which you can eat in a large ox by cooking. You can eat in a soft lamb by roasting. An example of that is the ends of the shoulder bone cartilages, and it also adds in soft gidin, soft sinewy materials, that's nerves and ligaments and sinews and things like that. They also count like flesh. Okay, now the Gemara introduces the machlokes of Yochanan and Reish Lakish, very related to the subject. The machlokes is when we want to define flesh, do we go by what is edible on the sheep now, or do we go by what is going to be edible on the sheep when it grows up? Nafka mina is sinews. Sinews get harder, at least some of them get harder, and when the sheep gets older, it will not be edible at all. Rav Yochanan holds, you look at what the story is now. It's edible now, it's kosher, it counts as meat. Reish Lakish says, no, you look at the future. In the future, it's going to be hard, and it's not going to be edible, then even now you cannot eat it and consider it to be meat. It says the Gemara, obvious proof to Reish Lakish from our Mishnah. Our Mishnah says that you follow anything which is edible when a cow is adult. The only possible exception might be the cartilages. We said cartilages, that you could eat, even though they might be too hard when it's a adult cow. So everything else, when specifically they were arguing about the gidin harachin, the sinews, everything else does not count. So Gemara says, Rabbi Yechon will answer, no. This is just an example, and it's an example to teach you the halacha. The cartilages is an example. What's the reason that the cartilages count, even though they're going to be too hard to eat in an adult cow? The reason is because you could cook it, and then it'll be edible. So, too, anything which you could cook and it'll be edible counts, and those are all the things that are soft when it's young, and the gidin that we're arguing about, those fit into that category as well. Okay, now, says Gemara, Rabbi Yirmiyah told Rabbi Avin, when you go to Rabbi Yevo in Eretz Yisrael, ask him the following kasha. Rabbi Yochanan here seems to say that you can eat the soft gidin because you only look at their status now, and now they're edible. But I'll show you somewhere else where he says you have to look at the future. And that's a discussion about the skin of a calf. The skin of a calf is soft and it's edible, and therefore Rabbi Yochanan says that it counts as food, and it's mekabel tumas oichlin. The tumah of food halachos of tumah apply to it. Even though when it grows up and it becomes an adult, the skins are going to be too hard to eat. That's what you make leather out of. It's not the kind of thing that you eat. So it's a contradiction. There, Rav Yochanan says you follow the future, and here he says you follow the present as far as the status of the animal's parts. So Gemara says, not a kasha. Don't worry about that. The Gemara has an expression here that says, don't worry about the flour. Whether it's good flour or it's not good flour, or it's coarse flour or it's edible flour, don't worry about that, because if Yochanan changed on that psak there, he was chayzer, as Reish Lakish said to him there. That was another machlokes with Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish had showed him a brisa. He had shown Reish Lakish a brisa which he thought supported him, and Reish Lakish said no, that's only a das yachid. And Rav Yochanan changed, and he also said it was das yachid. So he came off. He rejected that shita there. Therefore, it's not a contradiction at all. Okay, now we get to the next Mishnah, which discusses the halachos of breaking the bones of an animal. Breaking the bones of the carbon Pesach, which the Torah says is forbidden. And the Mishnah tells us that if you break the bone of a carbon Pesach, which is tahar in its proper time, you get malchus. It's an issa d'oraisa. But if you leave the bones over until it becomes nicer, so first of all, you don't get malchus for leaving over. Making something nicer is not, even though it's usher to leave over. If you do, you don't get malchus for that. Second of all, if you then break the bones once it's nicer, you don't get malchus for that. Also, if you break the bones of a tamei carbon, you don't get malchus for that. So 3 things you don't get malchus for: all types of psulim. You don't get malchus for making nicer. You don't get malchus for breaking the bones of nicer or of a tamei carbon. So the Gemara first introduces the subject, discussing why is it that you do not get malchus for these things. So first of all, making something nicer, we've seen this sugya before. We have a few explanations in a brisa as to why you would not get malchus for making something nicer. One opinion, the Tanakama in the brisa, is that it's a lav hanitik la'aseh. The Torah tells you how to fix the mistake. It says, you're not supposed to leave over, and if you do, then you burn it. So the Torah says that if you do, what happens is you burn it. Not if you do is what you get malchus. And anything that the Torah tells you what to do to fix it or to follow up on it, there's no malchus there. Rabbi Yaakov says the reason is because it's a lav shein b'maisa. You only get malchus for an issur that you do. Here it's something you did not do. You did not eat it on time. You just left it. It became nicer on its own. That is not something that you get malchus for. Okay, the Gemara now asks, what is the source that there is no malchus when somebody breaks a bone of a tamei carbon Pesach? The Gemara quotes a brisa, which is a machlokes tanaim, what exactly the drasha is. Very similar drashas for both of them. And then the rest of the sugya, the rest of the daf, will be explaining what is the case where there is a difference between these two tanaim. Where is there a machlokes? The drashas are so similar. So what's the brisa? The brisa says that it's learned out of the pasuk v'etzem le'sish b'ruba, you should not break a bone of it. What's of it? So the Tanakama says you should not break a bone of a kosher carbon, but a pasul carbon you could break. A carbon that has a psul, like if it became tamei, that you could break. There's no iser shviras etzem, no iser breaking a bone on a pasul carbon. Rebbe says it slightly differently. He says, if you look at the beginning of the pasuk, it said, "Babayis echad ye ochel," should be eaten in one house. And then later it says, so it's referring to something which is eaten. Only something which you can eat has an isser to break a bone, and something which you cannot eat has no isser to break a bone. So they're arguing over whether the isser to break a bone applies only to something which isn't puzzle or only to something which is edible. Says the Gemara, what is the case of something which is either puzzle but edible, or not edible but not puzzle? Where do you have something which qualifies for only one and not the other? And the Gemara is going to make a long list of Amoraim and their suggestions. Each Amor argues with the Amor before. So the Gemara's first offer is from Rabbi Yirmiyah, and Rabbi Yirmiyah says it's talking about a carbon Pesach where roiv of the congregation was tamei. So you brought a tamei carbon. Now you were allowed to bring it and you're allowed to eat it. However, it's still considered a puzzle. It's a puzzle that you're allowed to bring and eat, and therefore this will depend on the machlokes between Rabbi and the Tanakama. Says the Gemara, Rabbi Yosef disagrees with that. Rabbi Yosef says no. Everybody would say that there's no isser there because it's definitely a puzzle carbon. Again, we're assuming that tuma B'tzibor is dechuya. It's pushed off. We allow you to bring the carbon, but it's still a puzzle carbon. We're just allowing you to bring it and to eat it. So Rabbi Yosef therefore says zom shat. Rabbi Yosef says that the nafkamina between them is a case where the tumah struck the carbon after all the avodos were already performed. So it's a kosher carbon, but you just can't eat it. The carbon Pesach was brought b'kashros. It became tamei later. You can't eat it. Abaye says, no, that doesn't make sense. Everybody would agree that that's a kosher carbon. You can't break a bone there. Abaye says the machlokes is before nightfall. When the carbon is finished, it's completed, it's ready to go, but night hasn't struck yet. It hasn't become night yet. You can't eat it yet because you're only allowed to eat it at night. However, it's a kosher carbon. So according to the Mani Amar, that the isser of breaking the bones only applies to kosher karbanis. You can't break the bone then. According to the Mani Amar, that says that it's only when you could eat it, you could break a bone. It's not the time of eating yet. Now the Gemara has a kasha on this explanation of Abaye. The Gemara has a kasha from a Brisa, where it's Rebbe. Rebbe is the one in the Brisa. According to Abaye's version, Rebbe should say that you are allowed to break the bone because it's not edible yet. But Rebbe says that you're allowed to count yourself as part of a carbon Pesach based on the brain in the skull. Why? Because you can get the brain out. Without breaking the bone of the skull, there's holes, you can manage to scratch the brain out, and you can get a kizayas out of there and eat it. However, a different large bone, like the hip bone, which has a kizayas of marrow in it, you will not be able to get that out, because you'll have to break the bone. Therefore, well, he doesn't say that because you have to break the bone, but that's the implication. Therefore, you cannot count yourself to the carbon Pesach based on the marrow in the hip bone, even though there's a kazayis of marrow there. So Gemara says, Akash on Abaye is, according to Abaye, Rebbe should hold that you could break the bone before nightfall. You could break it before nightfall, get the marrow out, and then you could use that. Why does he say that you can't count yourself as part of the carbon based on the marrow inside a bone like a hip bone that you have to break to get out? So Gemara says, not a kasha. It's Gzeir Derabanan, even though really correctly you could get the marrow out as a Gzeir Derabanan, that you can't count this as part of your as your meat that you can eat for the carbon. Gemara brings a couple of different versions as to what the Gzeir Derabanan is. And the Gemara, first of all, proves that there has to be a Gzeir Derabanan. The Gemara says even if you don't hold like Abaye that you could break it before nightfall, there's still a way to get the marrow out. Put a coal on it and burn a hole in it. Why can't you do that? Must be this Gzeir Derabanan. What's Gzeir Derabanan there? So Gemara says, according to Abaye, will tell you the Gzeir Derabanan is we're afraid that while you're burning it, you're going to break it. And Rava says we're afraid that you're going to burn some of the actual marrow and then you'll be burning perfectly viable kachim. You're not allowed to do that. Now, because of this is Derabanan, we say that you can't put a coal on it and burn a hole in it. So therefore, says Abaye, not a problem on me. We don't want you to break the bone before nightfall. Gzeir Derabanan, you may come and end up breaking the bone after nightfall. Okay, the Gemara continues this list of Amoraim and how they explained it. Abaye says, Abaye we just did. The next opinion is Rav Papa. Rav Papa says no. In the case of Abaye, everybody would say that there is an Isser breaking the bone, even before nightfall. Here, the nafkamina is about a limb which went partially outside the walls of Yerushalayim. The part that's stuck out of the walls is puzzle, it's the psol of Yaitse. However, the part which is inside is kosher. The problem is, how are you going to break it? Can you cut it at the border between the kosher and puzzle part? So, we say as follows. You can't eat it. You aren't able to eat the border there because it's just a border. There's nothing to eat. On the other hand, it's not puzzle in that spot because the kosher, the inside part, is kosher. So are you allowed to break it in that spot? That would depend on the machlokes between Rebbe and the Tanakama. If the Isser Shviras Atzem applies on something which is not edible but puzzle. Says the Gemara, there's a brisa that supports one of these stadim in this machlokes. Rabbi Shmuel ben Elisha of Yechon ben Berka says in the brisa, a limb of an animal which went partially out of Yerushalayim, there is no Isser Shviras Atzem to break the bone over there. Okay, our next Amayra is Rav Sheshes Breder Avidi. He says no, any case like that would not have an Isser Shviras Etzem. That would be fine because it's a totally puzzle aver. Part of it went outside Yerushalayim. It's puzzle entirely. The nafkamina between the two opinions is if the limb is raw. A raw limb is not edible. You're not allowed to eat it raw. The Torah says you're not allowed to eat it raw. On the other hand, it's kosher, so it's not edible, but it's kosher. That would be the nafkamina. Says Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, no, that doesn't make any sense because you could just roast it. Don't tell me that it's not edible. Go ahead and roast it, and it's perfectly edible. Nobody would say you're allowed to break the bone when it's raw. The machlokes is about part of the pieces of the animal which go on the mizbeach. They're kosher, but you can't eat them because they belong on the mizbeach. What's the example of that? The alya, the tail. Now the tail itself is fatty, but there's a bone holding the tail, so he's saying that would be the isser. Shviras Etzem would be a nafkamina about that. It's not edible, so there's no isser Shviras Etzem according to Rabbi, but it's not puzzle, and therefore there is an isser Shviras Etzem according to the Tanakama. Okay, the Gemara's next opinion is Rav Ashi. Rav Ashi says no, anything which goes in the mizbech doesn't have an isser Shviras Etzem. There's certainly no problem because there's no circumstances in which you could eat it at all. It's totally out of the realm of eating. The entire machlokes then, the nafkamina, is about a limb which does not have a kizayis of meat on it. According to the Maniyama that says it has to be kosher, it's definitely kosher. However, it's not edible because it doesn't have any meat or doesn't have enough meat. Ravina says, no, any case like that, it's not going to have an Isser Shviras Etzem. There's no meat involved. The machlokes is where it has meat, but the meat is on the end of the limb, not in the place of the breaking of the bone. The bone has meat on it, but the place you want to break it does not. Can you break it there? Do you say that on the one hand it's kosher, on the other hand there's nothing to eat in that spot? The Gemara now quotes a brisa, which is Rebbe saying his opinion, and Rebbe specifically lists 4 of the cases where he clearly shows that even though it's kosher, it's einei roya la'achila, it's not edible, and therefore there is no isser breaking the bone. These 4 examples, and the Gemara quotes the brisa. The brisa says, Rebbe says, it says b'bayis echad ya'achal. Afterwards it says etzem l'sishbru by the isser of breaking a bone only applies to something edible. To exclude, it does not apply to an animal which, although it had a kosher avoda, but it became a puzzle or tameh right after the avoda finished, and therefore it's not edible. That's excluded from the Isser. That was Rav Yosef's pshat. So now we see that Rav Yosef is at least reflected in this brisa. The next one is if it does not have a shear, it doesn't have a minimum size that is edible, there's nothing to eat. That is Rav Ashi. Possibly Ravina could agree to that as well. The third is that if it's supposed to go on the mizbeach, then it's not edible. The parts that are supposed to go on the mizbeach, that's Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak. And the last one quoted is Abaye, which the brisa says that before the time of eating, before nightfall, you would be allowed to break the bones because it's kosher, but it's not edible.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.